Hello, everyone, and welcome to whatever this is, Making the Rounds, I guess, where we talk about stuff. It's just my general all encompassing
Yeah.
thing for stuff I do with Emily because I can't come up with other titles, and I thought this one was really cool, and I was really proud of myself, and now you have a really weird insight into the deep, dark recesses of my psyche. However, that won't stop here because we are about to talk about the European League of Legends Championship
Woo!
Series. And
Yes.
we all know that league is very near and dear to my heart as a deeply biased European League of Legends analyst slash content creator. So, of course, this is going to be full of really overstated things about how wonderful the EU LCS is and how everyone should watch it and it's the greatest league of all time. No, actually, it's going to be about how the EU LCS is in trouble, and people are even speculating that it may lose its major region status or become like GPL or something like this. I don't know. Probably the next time I check Reddit, people are going to say that the EU LCS is literally going to be replaced by a mascot dancing party. So, um,
I mean, UOL already have a leg up, so
well, did you see that Mysterious Monkeys are now wearing their
yes,
thing?
yes,
And
I
then, of
did.
course, like
I
the
did.
G2 esports guys. And it probably next week I'm going to show up to EU LCS and say, nope, games are canceled. We are literally just going to have the mascots fight each other in the parking lot. And that's going to be the end of the entire fucking thing. Anyway,
Nice.
I don't know what exactly is going on, okay? But there are a lot of comments and concerns and stuff about where people are trying to find out what's wrong with the EU LCS, why there's a drop in viewership, because there has been a marked drop in viewership. And you can look at some of it is made really dramatic by the fact that the English stream dropped and a lot of the foreign language streams rose up. But even aggregating all of those, we have seen a decline in EU LCS viewership, excuse me, relative to NALCS viewership. So first, we're going to talk about a really standout assumption that I saw, which is that the EULCS viewership started to decline when North America went into best of threes, the clearly superior best format ever, and the EULCS went to the lowly, terrible,
Best of two.
sad, and unexciting.
Everyone hates them except me.
Yeah, I don't hate them. Best of twos. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that has been blamed and whether or not we think it makes sense. So first of all, for those of you who don't know and think that best of twos are awesome because of competitive integrity and the ability to adapt mid-series and the fact that they're shorter and less
Me.
annoying, best of threes are considered better by the majority of the fan base because they give a sense of closure or they give a sense of excitement. I don't know. What are we in a relationship? I can't, with this like 3 game series, I don't really understand why I need closure in NIP versus Mysterious Monkeys. So,
I
just.
mean, I'm not sure if you could watch those games and even call what happened closure, but anyway, I think this is an interesting argument to me because I try to, and like, I think this is a weakness of me specifically because I am not the typical viewer, right?
Mhm.
So when I say I want best of twos, I think I say that, but I do recognize that most people don't. Um, and I think that when best of twos and best of threes were first announced, people like have really short memories when talking about Europe now, I think, because there was a noticeable drop in NA viewership as well to like initially because people it splits your focus, right? So even say like this past weekend, I'm hanging out at NA LCS like I always do because I'm there doing interviews every week, and your focus is split because there's a dual stream. There's so many games going on, and that was something that was really hard for people to wrap their heads around initially, especially with the dual stream. And I think that a lot of the best of two versus best of three arguments conveniently forget that there's also been a slight drop in North American viewership just because there's so many freaking games. Like, there's so many games to watch now in the regular season. And that's actually why I really like best of twos, because I don't need quote unquote closure in a regular season series.
Emily's
For
a
me,
heartbreaker.
I know. For
Yeah.
me, the regular season is for seeding for playoffs, and therefore I get everything I want out of a best of two. Equal side distribution, adaptation happens a lot of the time, and then I don't need to have one team like quote unquote winning over the other team, and that added game a lot of times is it's just a lot of games. Like all of the regions that have adapted best of threes, it's a lot of games to get through.
I think
Uh,
also, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of games, and we're saying this obviously as people who our job is to watch basically everything. But for the casual fans, they just say, okay, we skip this, which leads to a drop in viewership. I think ultimately, however, the thing is that the problem that led to the decline in EU viewership, even relative to NA, because I think it did drop off more severely, wasn't
yeah,
that
it
they
did.
went best of twos. It was that there are so many games, and now you have to choose between the two. So when I first started writing about League of Legends, it was season 3, and I was like, oh, I actually have time to watch all of these games and have a full time job in China, OGN, excuse me, GPL, LCS, NALCS, EU LCS. I had time to watch all of these games and still have a full time job. And then now and I felt like I had more free time as well. And now it's just like, no, I
Yep.
don't. Because there are just so many games. And so when you do that as a casual fan, you pick and choose what you watch because most people are not insane. And I think
Or
that's,
it like isn't their job. Like I want
yeah,
to, because I'm gonna bring up more stuff about this later, but like I want to make it clear, like we're not trying to shame anyone for not
yeah,
watching games. Like if you don't want to watch TLP1, like that, or like I'm just picking two teams at the bottom. I'm not like shitting on either of those teams, but like if you don't want to watch like Mysterious Monkeys Nip, if you don't want to watch TLP1, like that's fine. Like I'm not trying to shame people for choosing their favorite teams or choosing the best teams to watch, because it's something that happens in viewership in general. Like larger fan bases and more successful teams will get more viewers. And that happens as like the stratification in that happening especially happens when there's just so many games to choose from.
so I think in general, the argument that people watched less because of BO2 is missing the point because I think there are a lot of other issues which we'll get to as we talk about kind of why later on. But I think it was just more there are so many games, and so when you choose North American LCS, and that ended up being something that people went gravitated to a lot more. So I think that that argument is a little bit of a red herring, and I guess like overall people felt that the change to BO3 was more exciting. So maybe there is something to that. I kind of like that. Also, I think something that may have been a good quality of life change is that you don't split streams when you watch EU LCS. It feels like a much more whole, like together kind of system.
Yeah.
Some fans have kind of complained that if they get bored with one stream in NA, they switch to the other one, so it's fine for them. And you can't do that in EU, so it's easier to get distracted, kind of.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
for me, again, I'm recognizing that I'm not the viewer that they want, right? Like I'm not the viewer that they're trying to market to. But I will say I love the fact that I can just sit down and focus on a game in Europe, because like in North America, I basically have to choose which game I want to watch in the moment, even though I'm probably interviewing people from both games. So I have to split focus regardless in order to be able to ask like any sort of competent questions. And then additionally, I have to go home and then rewatch games because I will not have had uh, you know, a very specific focus on those games. So as someone who like is really dedicated to the scene, the split stream is really
I,
obnoxious to me. But I will say that I think if you have a more casual viewer, obviously to your point, they're just going to switch to whichever, like in North America, they're just going to switch to whatever stream is more important to them. And I also do know that as a general rule, unless there's like a TSM game on stream too at the same time, or like a, like C9 game, one of the teams that has like a really large fan base, I do know that typically I want to say NALCS 1, just by the fact that it's the first stream, gets more viewership on average.
I think it just occurred to me, like this is really random, how much money I could get if I did NALCS interviews instead of EU LCS interviews, because I get paid by the interview. And you can get double that on Saturdays and Sundays. It's impressive. Okay, anyway, moving on.
I have not monetized this, actually. I do a ton of interviews and I just save them up for features. So apparently I'm not like...
You're not doing it correctly.
Not doing it right, yeah.
See, you can do both, Emily. I do both. Because I transcribe the interview and I publish it and then I make a feature later and then I get paid again. So see how much money you could be making.
I'm not marketing myself correctly.
No, I think I actually don't do that. But the point is, the point of this entire thing, however, is that there are a lot of games. And there's, I think that that's going to be more than anything a reason for a decline in regions that aren't as well produced or as well advocated. And we'll get into this more because we're moving on to the next complaint, which is the group stage. And I think that there's some validity to some of these, like when people are talking about how it seems like the matches matter less. I don't really know like how, in terms of seeding and point values, I think that there is some weight to that, but the reality of the situation is that I think that because EU is split so heavily in terms of top to bottom, that there would still be a lack of weight in some of the EU LCS games relative to, I don't know, some of the weird, crazy, like we rarely have an EU LCS. We've had it a lot more this split, but since 2016, we've rarely had situations where your bottom team is taking games off your top team. Like usually, like last year even, we had bottom four almost never took a game off of top six. And so I think that this is something that makes you really, really difficult if you watch games because you don't want to know who wins, right? If you watch games because you want to be excited and you want to see the back and forths, I think that makes EU a little bit more difficult to market for that fan in general. And I think that this is a core problem. It's exacerbated to an extent by the group stage format, but I think it exists anyway. And I mean, it's exacerbated because like seeding is locked in maybe a little bit earlier between rungs. So if you have like the relegation rung, that seeding is locked in a little bit earlier. But I think at the same time, you're already going to know that Roccat, NIP, and VIT are probably not going to make playoffs like as soon as the season starts. It's just the way it is.
I mean, so to like attack this argument also from another side, one thing I like to look at is if you say put North America into groups, right? And I think last split, because there was so much parity and it was something that was talked about a lot. Like whenever people were talking about NA, they were like, oh my gosh, like any team can take on any team and this is great and we're having a ton of fun and it's a really exciting season. That wasn't because of the format. There was just a lot of parity in NA. Like this split, we've actually seen a lot more stratification to the point where Envy lost both of their series this past week and they still made playoffs because Echo Fox lost, right? So, and they were kind of like the last, I guess, bubble team. And there was already, I want to say before their final series, there's already like a 2 or 3 series lead. So there is separation between the top and the bottom this split. And I feel like if you had separated North America this split into groups, people would have had some similar issues. Because there are teams that are clearly towards the bottom and teams that are clearly at the top. And there have been very few like major upsets, in my opinion, this past split. I think the only ones you could really point to, like from this past week, we had Phoenix 1 beating Counter Logic Gaming, and that's a bit of an outlier because this was also CLG made a last minute roster move, right? Like really late in the season. So that's obviously like an extenuating circumstance that I don't think is necessarily born of a lot of parity in North America. So I think that the argument that the groups lead to it being more boring is not exactly the case, because I feel like if you did this to other regions, the same quote unquote problems would occur, right?
And let's talk about ways in which it's made a little bit more exciting, right? Okay, so let's say you have Fnatic G2 in separate groups. And let's say that you have Fnatic G2 H2K, because everyone is putting UOL in the top 4, and I'm really not, because I think they're garbage right now. Like, they look really bad. They're the only team that got way worse after Rift Rivals of the 3. I think, actually, G2 and Fnatic both improved a lot. But I think that if you put H2K, G2, and Fnatic in all together, and you got to see more series where H2K was playing against Fnatic and G2, then I think, or more series in general where H2K is playing, the final games between H2K and UOL in the last week, and the final games between G2 and Fnatic in the last week would potentially matter less, because they would have played more games and already, like, through process of repeated play, you're going to see these teams break up more. You're going to see stronger separation in knowing who is the best and who is the second best. So I think that the top side battle between G2 and Fnatic, for example, would be less exciting if it were mixed together. Because I think with a little bit more games, G2 would probably definitively come out more ahead because they're ramping up slowly.
I mean, the other thing that we can talk about here that you're a lot more familiar with than I am, but is China.
Yep.
And I don't think it's a 1-to-1 comparison because there are more teams.
And I think that makes it even worse, because if you expanded EU to 12 teams right now, you potentially would just get a bottom 6 and a top 6, and it's like, yeah, okay, maybe there's more excitement in the bottom 6 then, like maybe who's getting relegated is a little bit less clear, but I mean, that argument's poor, because this split, whoever's getting relegated doesn't really matter that much anyway, because franchising is going to decide who's in LCS next year.
Yeah.
And that's it, so bottom tier battles are not going to be quote unquote as exciting, theoretically. Anyway, so I don't think that that's a good valid point as to why EU LCS is less exciting. The other aspect of this is just like in the LPL, right? You have stupid things where Snake take games off of WE, and that's just a product of LPL being LPL all the time, because there's never going to be, I don't think there's been a split where the top team doesn't lose at least a game to literally the worst team in the league. I don't think that's happened in the entire history of LPL. I'll have to double check. It may have been in I think the OMG season where they only lost to IG and WE is an exception. But I think otherwise they literally always lose games to the worst team.
Yeah. Even in EDG's most dominant season, and we talked about this years ago on China Talk, but they were making weird roster substitutions and they just started dropping games. And
when they didn't lose a single series, they dropped games to bottom tier teams left and right, because bottom tier teams are the only teams with top laners.
Yep.
So I think that that's just an LPL thing. So that's going to happen, but the format doesn't hurt that in the LPL. So maybe you then make the argument that, okay, this format isn't right for EU. And I think that that's maybe tangential at best, because maybe it's a little weak, because I still think you get people complaining about how EU isn't that interesting because of a lack of parity, even without this format. It just makes parts of it really obvious. I also think that, the argument that, okay, you're missing the point. We don't have to watch more NIP versus MM if we don't want to. We don't have to watch that second series. But we want to see more H2K versus Fnatic. Okay, I understand where you're coming from, but you watching one extra best of three isn't going to make isn't going to like drastically increase viewership of the league as a whole. It's not going to make the
Yeah.
league seem more exciting as a whole. It's going to mean that maybe few more people are watching one more series. I
And
mean,
like even in North America, like people don't. So like even with more people wanted to tune into TL this past week, right? For
mhm.
obvious reasons, because they were going to start Dardoch at least one of their games. But
That's
even
what
the
EU needs. We need someone to
EU
come
needs a
in. We
Dardoch.
need someone to come in and give like NIP with Nico the Pico, like probably the least competent coach in either LCS. We need to give someone to come in to NIP and give Nico the Pico like billions of dollars, and he can just buy whatever player he wants. And then as this continuously fails, like NIP becomes an exciting team to follow because of like how incompetent and terrible it is. I don't think we should do that,
I
actually,
mean, it
but
certainly hasn't actually helped the competitiveness of Team Liquid over the past two splits.
it
But
probably has helped their viewership numbers.
yeah, I mean, it has. But my point is that, like,
So would winning games,
even that game wasn't watched by a lot of people. Like, it still was not to the level of what you get on a Saturday or Sunday, because their first game was on a Friday.
Sure.
It still was not what you'd get to the level of a Saturday or Sunday, even just like a basic game, right? Because games have different viewership on different nights, and typically Friday games are generally the least watched, I'd say. I'd have to like go back and run the numbers, but just when I notice view counts, the Friday games seem to be slightly less. I think it's because a lot of people are doing things on Friday where they might not be doing as many things in the middle of the day on Saturday, for example.
Sure.
My point is that like even something dramatic like that with a bottom tier team didn't necessarily like skyrocket their viewership.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think
it's not always I mean, any teams that are in the bottom tier, I think, are typically going to be watched less.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely true, and there's not really a way to avoid that. Even if there is like exciting parity in the NLCS, there are still teams that are worse.
Yep.
So I don't know if again this isn't necessarily a format thing, but the question is okay if it's not like all of this stuff going on, then what is it really? And do you wanted to do a quick rant before we get into that about how people compare the viewership of different leagues, right?
Yeah. So I guess one thing that I always see whenever so it's typically someone who is from North America,
mm-hmm.
And they come out and they say like,
Wicked is offended.
Man, actually, I'm not even picking on Wicked, but he's like the top comment saying this in the Reddit thread. That's why Kelsey is bringing it up. But I did want to talk a little bit about how people approach viewership in leagues that are not their own. Specifically, like an NA fan that says, "Hey, like I watch North America because it's my region, and I watch Korea because it's the best, and then I don't watch like all of these other like I don't watch Europe because it's boring, etc., etc." And I've actually had like some of my friends that are casual fans say that to me. So I'll pick on them. I'll say that this is my rant to them. And these are friends not in esports. They're just friends of mine that happen to watch League occasionally.
Oh, you have those? Okay, weird.
I know, right? Like it's kind of insane. One of them I actually got him into it. But anyway, my point is that unless you are watching, say, like yesterday or last night or this morning for me, kind of blurs all together. We had Ever 8 versus Jin Air. Exciting matchup, right? Like it actually has playoff implications, and I can tell you that a lot fewer people were watching that. A lot fewer people were watching MVP Afrika, even though, again, it has playoff implications. Jin Air are still in the race for the playoffs. I'm not sure how many people know that, but it's kind of insane. And Jin Air and Afrika play later this week, And I still bet that that game is going to get less viewership from North America than, say, like KT Longju, which is a game that I actually really hyped up earlier because, again, playoff implications, two of the top teams in Korea. And so one thing I always see is that people watch Korea. And no, it's not a one-to-one comparison because most people that watch Korea only watch the top teams. And I am not
Emily's being a hipster.
I am not in any way shitting on you if you do not want to watch MVP versus Rocks Tigers throw the game back and forth at each other for 50 minutes, because I don't wish that on anyone. I don't even know why I watch it myself. I'm just insane.
I don't wish the entirety of LPL on anyone. Don't stop.
But like, my point isn't to say like you're not a true fan if you don't watch these games. My point is that you cannot make a comparison in the overall viewership of the region by saying I watch Korea if you're only watching like these top games. And that's totally fine. It actually plays into a lot of the points that we've already made about viewership, and that the top teams are just going to get more viewers, not only within their region, but within other regions watching. And additionally, one thing that has happened in Korea, and obviously I don't have the exact viewership counts, like Korean viewership counts, but there have been fan accounts and employee accounts that have come out and have been posted on Reddit even, that have been like, the new Korean format is not as great for Koreans attending games. And if you notice, if you compare the old tournament format, like the super old tournament format, and the audiences for that in comparison to like the audience last night for Jin Ever 8, there's a lot fewer people in the audience. A lot of that has to do with timing. It's students and young professionals seeing things after school or after work. Typically you have a lot more fans trickle in like as the games go on, but still there's not the same, and I'm only doing this based on like an eye test of viewers in the studio, but since they switched to the best of 3 format with like so many other games, no casual fan has time to watch all that. Like they just don't. And it's happened even in Korea, the best region in the world. Fewer people are watching those like bottom tier games. So I just wanted to like point that out, because I feel like a lot of North American viewers say they watch NA because they have a team in NA, or you know, that's their region, and then they watch Korea because it's the best region. Typically, I don't think people are watching Korea in real time just because it is an inconvenient time for most people in North America. But then additionally, so typically they're watching it from VODs, and then additionally, not a lot of the bottom tier matches are getting watched. And again, like, I really want to reiterate, like, I am totally with you if you do not want to watch BBQ Olivers versus Ever 8.
So
because sometimes I don't even want to watch it, but like I do because it's my job, and I don't know, there's fun stuff that happens in every game.
So but what is your point? So what is your point if it's not to you know, dismiss people who only watch?
My point is that stop making comparisons to why EU viewership sucks to I watch Korea and NA. Like, because typically your views for Korea are not the same as counting views for Europe within itself. They're two separate things. So stop making that comparison.
So you're saying that we shouldn't compare like outside non-native Korean fans to native European fans?
I just don't think that there's a comparison that really can be had there.
So you feel like the overall problem isn't necessarily that fewer North American LCS fans are finding time to also watch Europe. It's that fewer European fans are finding time to watch Europe and would rather watch NA. Is that what you're suggesting, or?
I am suggesting that actually, but I also think it's both. Like, I think...
Yeah, I think it's both. So I think the Korean thing is almost kind of relevant because you still do have fewer NA fans watching EU now. So I do think that kind of thing, the comment is relevant, because maybe in the past people would have had time to watch NA and EU in Korea. Or maybe...
it was a lot easier. Like, to your point, like back in season 3, season 4, it was super easy to watch all three of those regions for me,
Mhm.
because tournament format for Korea, best of ones for NA and EU, and like I would watch every day. And I had a full-time job as well, not in esports.
Yep. Okay, so
Anyway, that
I
was my
think
career rant.
that was your career rant. It's just don't say you watch Korea if you don't watch the bad teams. Okay.
No, just don't draw the comparison to the lack of EU viewership to like, because I think it's relevant if you're saying I choose to watch Korea over Europe, but typically the timing is off. Like the two aren't going to overlap. So you're typically your NA fan who's saying this is typically watching it from
Well, yeah,
GOG
it's again,
anyway.
it's like
So
a
it doesn't
time zone
contribute to the
thing.
viewership.
So I guess so. Yeah. All right. So we've ranted about all of this stuff. So what actually is the problem? And I probably will go back and cut a little bit where there was, I don't know, random talking. But let's see. So what is the problem? I think a big problem, and people brought this up, is that it doesn't feel like it feels like EU is boring. And this is something that comes up a lot, even outside of format, in that it's that the storylines or the players aren't interesting. And as someone who spent time interviewing these players, talking to teams and things behind the scenes, like that's really wrong. I just think that there is a limited sense of outlets for these players to express their personalities in a way that North American teams also have. And you can see this in a lot of ways across the way in which the broadcast chooses to focus on information in the segments that they want to run. I think it's the broadcast resources themselves. Like the Riot EU team has always had fewer resources than the NA Riot team for production value. I think that there's the fact that there are more analytical content creators for whatever reason flocking to the EU scene rather than narrative driven content creators. But there's a lot of stuff and a lot of reasons why players are not coming off as interesting as the NA players. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what you think that might be.
It's weird because I feel like at this point, I don't know, I don't even know where I can pinpoint the origin of this. But since EU LCS started, it's odd to me, but this has always been like a prevalent narrative where people are like, Europe is boring to watch, but they're quote unquote like better than NA. And I don't know why. Like again, I can't
I can
remember
come
the
up
specific.
with. I think in the past it was a lot more to do with the games because in like season 3, season 4, season 2, there was a lot of Froggen had a lot of influence. CLGEU had a lot of influence where there were these games where okay, we're going to farm until Froggen can hard carry on Anivia, like these kinds of games that were very like separated laning phase. Jungler didn't necessarily do much until team fights, and this type of play style was allowed to happen because people didn't really understand minion control or anything like this, and that was generally why people called EU boring in the past. I think as like post starting in season 5, that was really not the case at all. Like the playstyle changed a lot. Teams started to be more aggressive, a lot because of teams like Fnatic and Unicorns of Love. And then it became the players are boring. So I think
it also became lane swaps are boring, and I don't know, like, because I remember
EU is the
another
lane swap
like
region, yeah. That's
huge prevalent narrative last year. So like this whole my point is that like the whole narrative, and I don't know, like it's even driven, I guess, as a whole in the English speaking league community, like fan community, that like Europe is boring. And first it was, like you said, this gentleman's agreement basically where they'd be farming for 20 minutes and then fight. But then I remember even last year before the lane swap changes hit, where everyone's like, Europe is so boring because all they do is lane swap, and lane swaps are boring. So I feel like there's also this weird tendency to attribute anything that people think is boring in game to European teams for whatever reason. I don't even know if that's necessarily true. It's just a narrative that I constantly see, and like one that I try to avoid. To be honest.
So I think, yeah, the general narrative is just like the lane swap thing. I think hurt you a little bit because people are talking about like what kind of flavor does the EU LCS have, and I think they were like kind of on the forefront of the lane swap meta for a while, and this was driven through H2K a lot, and now it's kind of like, oh gosh, what is Deficio going to talk about on broadcast? I have no idea.
If it's not lane swap, yeah.
So it's and then teams kind of lost their identity for a really long time after that, and I think that also a lot of players leaving all the time. People bring this up. I don't think it's as dramatic as people tend to state, but the problem is that after players retire or after players leave, there isn't a lot of effort done by a broadcast community to bring up rookies. Like EU LCS last split had more rookies than any other major league starting on rosters. So I think that that's a huge thing. Is you already know Doublelift, you already know Rainover. Like even your crappy teams have really well-known iconic players. So if you say you don't like Team Liquid and they're terrible, but you really like Piglet, right? You're a big Piglet fan. You're gonna watch them anyway. And there aren't really teams like that unless you count Mysterious Monkey's amazing.
I mean, this ties into something that is not necessarily a problem with League of Legends as a whole, but something I've definitely noticed coming from more of a traditional sports background where you have people, so like say me, I grew up following most of the Boston teams because I'm from Boston, and I think my mom would have murdered me if I wasn't a Red Sox fan. But I don't see that with League of Legends. I definitely see it as more of a player, so like players first, then oddly enough, region second, and then team third. I think generally that is what I see in terms of I am a fan of, usually when you ask like, who are you, like, what are you a fan of in League of Legends? People typically say a player, like most of the time. Then when it comes to international events, there's the separation by region, and then like third it comes down to team. So, and that's not something that's just in Europe, it's something that's prevalent like across the board with a few noticeable exceptions of teams that have really branded themselves well, like for example SK Telecom, by like not only by virtue of winning, but just, you know, they're very well known in the international community. They've branded themselves, they've been in esports for forever. You have TSM, obviously, very well-known example of how to brand yourself in the international community. And my point isn't that EU teams suck at branding themselves, although I know that's another topic we're going to touch upon. But if you have a lot of players rotating out, what does tend to happen with the LoL community is that they find it a little bit harder to keep their attention if their favorite player is no longer playing, because it is such a player-driven fan base.
I think that's fair. I also think that in terms of building up new players, NALCS does a lot more player-driven features, like the dive, or I mean, not the dive, the drive. The drive. Like they do the dive and the drive, and that's whatever else. Whereas I feel like if you're going to tune into the EU LCS, there's a segment before where, you know, James Stress O'Leary is talking about tanks. Yeah, okay, so this is like a difference in how the broadcasts have decided to talk about things. It's like we're going to have very player narrative driven features where you have Dardoch and Doublelift smack talking before CLG TSM games. Or, I mean, they've done a little bit more of this. Like, I found the Splice Misfits one kind of funny. I personally Misfits games are getting highlighted much more, even though I don't think Misfits is a good team, just because of how funny Maxlor is and how much Maxlor is willing to like make ironic shit talking. Very, very British humor. But I think that that's a big thing where they're not necessarily bringing these personalities out of these players as consistently as the NA team is, in part because some of them are new. They aren't as comfortable in the media spotlight yet. And they haven't put in a lot of work with that with their limited resources because it is probably easier, and a lot more of the analysts and personalities in EU are inclined to talk about lane swaps, are inclined to talk about why we have tanks.
I will also say, like, it's a lot easier to focus. So, like, I know we've talked about this extensively elsewhere. You just wrote an article on it in relation to Dardoch. But, like, in my opinion, Europe does have a lot more talent coming up from the ladder directly. To your point, there are a ton, like, more rookies in Europe last year. And I do think that because there are so few rookies in North America, and there are so few new players coming up because teams focus a lot more. I mean, that kind of changed in Europe this split, but teams focus a lot more on importing. And even those imports, a lot of them are high profile, so they kind of try to market them. I'm actually not super high on how a lot of teams have tried to market their imports, because I think they could have done a better job. My point more is that, like, when the broadcast does focus on any talent coming up, right? How many rookies did we have in North America last split? We had three to vote on. So, like, and then
three this split,
we have three by virtue of the fact that they came in later on in the split. We didn't even have rookies at the beginning of the split. So, in terms of focusing a narrative on one specific player, it's a lot easier to say, like, oh, this split we have Acadian, Contract, and Cody Sun. And so we can do separate features on every single one of them. And that's very easy because you only have 3 players. So even if, like, you know, they're kind of shaky on camera or awkward at first, you can typically draw that out, especially if you do more stuff with them throughout the split. And it's just a lot easier to market 3 players than it is to market however many rookies were in EU last split. You probably didn't know the number, but, like, it's that 3 is less than 12 or whatever, so it's a lot easier to market.
I think it was
3 players as opposed to 12
it was
players.
like 12 or 15 or something. I know.
For some reason, 12
was like
is sticking in my mind.
LPL had almost as many, so I wasn't sure if the 12 number was EU or LPL. But the point is,
like, you see, like, even this split. So, like, Mike Young was the first rookie to jump onto the scene, right? And, like, everyone jumped on him. Like, everyone wanted to interview him. Everyone still kind of wants to interview him and figure him out. He was on the broadcast, like, commenting on a game last week. So it's just, like, I do feel like when there's less to focus on, the attention is a lot more easily drawn to these specific players.
Europe also has the added problem of a lot of times when players are rookies, they have English, like their English is competent, but it's not super fluent in Europe, for example. So if you're doing, they can interact with certain, like, Spanish media. Spanish players can interact with Spanish media. French players can interact with French media. But, I mean, Hans was a rookie this last split, Hansama from Misfits, and I interviewed him, and he understands the stuff, but he's not going to be super open in French. He's going to speak, like, short sentences, give short answers, and he's going to have to, like, think about your question first. So I think that there's that kind of barrier too when you have rookies. Like, after a while, players are living in a team that speaks entirely English all the time, and then Soaz has to start thinking about how to speak French again. And so to do a French interview. So I think there are all sorts of elements that go into why might be harder to bring up rookies sometimes. Also, a lot of orgs haven't been very high on making their own content. in Europe. This is a very big NA thing. And I think that a lot of orgs in EU haven't really been doing that, partly because of a lack of funding. And it's kind of a vicious cycle because you can't really figure out how to market effectively without having money to experiment. You can't really get money without marketing effectively. But I think,
Yeah.
for example, like people aren't making their own shows. They aren't as much. They aren't making huge segments for teams and players that are as engaging. They aren't getting like weird underwear sponsorship ads or uh, stuff like this that's going on for the players. So I think it's difficult from that front as well. I mean, we saw Origin trying to advertise their new roster.
I mean, it turned into a meme, so maybe that was better advertising for them.
But it didn't tell you anything about the players, right?
Yeah, no.
Such a weird problem.
It is visible, highly visible, though. I think more to that point as well, something that, like, not to call out players, because I don't think they, like, begrudge doing interviews, but at the same time, like, they definitely need pushes from management to do these things, right? Like, I doubt that the Immortals team last year went up to Noah and was like, we really want to do this underwear ad where we're going to be like super embarrassing and it's going to be hilarious. I think that what happened was that their management told them, hey, you need to do this because they're a sponsor or because it'll make money for our team or whatever. So I do think a lot of that comes from, or at least in North America, I get the distinct impression that a lot of that comes from the org themselves. Like I know we've called him out a couple times for being like amazing, because I know you talked to him a lot when you were in when he was in Europe with P1. But like Riley, for example, is a really great liaison for Phoenix One, who is basically like ensuring that like all of his players are like open to interviews, forcing them to have a translator, especially when you have a player like Arrow who is like super eager to speak English because he always wants to practice. But to get more nuanced answers, like Riley is in there being like, maybe you should use a translator, like even stuff like that. He's always focused on making sure that the players are constantly communicating with the media, that they're used to having media around, that they are willing to do these interviews with us. And it's something that I really appreciate, but it's also something that is definitely coming from the org itself, right? Because they want to market themselves, and that comes from the top down. I don't think you'll have players necessarily reaching out on their own to do these kind of features because either it might not occur to them or they just might not want to do it unless someone is kind of pushing them into it.
There are a few players that are focused on their brand, at least initially, that are very mindful of how they want to market themselves and how they want to appear to the public and things like that. I think G2 do a reasonable job. Like there aren't, just at bottom, there aren't players that stream in EU nearly as much as there are players that stream in NA. And I think that also the issue with that is that you have young players who aren't thinking a lot about the future. They're thinking, I'm going to play for a while. It's going to be fun. And also, if you have a bunch of young players and you have a lot of, and you don't have a lot of like inborn demand, it's hard to get a lot of like demand for players who aren't already big, or when there hasn't been a lot of international competition or interest has been waning, then the journalists kind of leave too. So it's hard to have players in this atmosphere where there are journalists constantly interviewing them. Like a good EU LCS day, there are 3 of us. On days where you have Rocket versus Nip and UL versus Monkeys, it's me. I sit in the press room. Who do you want to interview, Kelsey? But I think the problem, I mean, that's definitely a problem in and of itself, is that if there isn't like a lot of journalists also in the scene, then third-party journalists, then a lot more of the burden falls on the teams. A lot more of the burden falls on the broadcast. And I'm not even saying, like, why aren't journalists focusing on EU? Because if I were a journalist and I had to choose whether to focus on NA or EU, I would focus on EU because I made that choice. But theoretically speaking, it's not the smartest career choice in terms of being an English-speaking writer, writing for an English-speaking audience. Because again, like, yeah, sure, there are a lot of bilingual Europeans, but your primary audience is still the UK, basically, uh, when it gets right down to it. So, I don't know. I think it's a really weird and interesting space, and that is the fundamental challenge that I think that teams are facing, is that, okay, I have a team that's French with maybe 3 French players optimistically, and then I've got a Norwegian and like maybe I've got a Korean in there or something like this, or I have a German team with 1 German and a Hungarian, and what exactly am I doing with that? What sponsors do I get? Can I get German sponsors even though because I'm a German team? Can I get Hungarian sponsors because I have a German player? Is this weird? Like, what kind of fan base am I operating my team to? And I think that's why you see a lot of in other esports. You see like Danish CS:GO teams. You see much more of these attempts at making all single country teams because it's easier to market. But again, I think that hurts the talent base. And if your ultimate goal is, okay, we want to compete internationally, we want to compete against top level Korean teams, NA is taking all of our players. Like you end up in a situation where you optimally should build mixed nationality rosters, but then the marketing is difficult. So I think one really underexplored thing is like maybe Swedish fans and French fans would be much more excited about Ninjas in Pajamas versus Team Vitality if they made it like a Sweden versus France type situation. Because the orgs are these things, and we obviously the players aren't all French or the players aren't all Swedish, but you have a foothold in that area, and like the players can represent that to an extent if they're told to market to this type of fan base. So I think that's something that's underexplored. I think you can look at a lot of solutions in restructuring the league in that area as well that we won't go into super in depth, but I think that that's kind of an underexplored area in Europe that other esports have had some success with.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like I failed as a narrative writer. I need to do more Europe content.
Yeah, that's the other really weird thing is it's like for some reason I coincidentally wrote about LPL and EU LCS, and then Emily and Fionn, like Emily who does really, really great like written player focused features, is doing NA, and then you have Fionn who does like really narrative storylines types content, does NA as well. So I think that that's something else. It's like people like me.
I mean, it's kind of weird because I fell into NA, and like the reason why I'm kind of blaming myself a bit for not going out and reaching for those European storylines is because my first like region outside of Korea that I like really followed so I followed North America and Europe casually. Like I said, during season 3, when the LCS came about, I followed the LCS, like just both Europe and North America. But the first other region I started really writing about was Brazil. And like no one in English speaking audience cares about Brazil. And my challenge actually when I was hired by LOL Esports is I pitched 3 ideas, and the person who was in charge of hiring said, okay, I want you to do this one because it's about a Brazilian player and no one, like, make me care was basically what she said. Like, she was like, make me care about this player. And I was like, okay, I have to do a really good job. And going back and comparing that to my other stuff, I think it's actually shit. But my point is that, like, at the time, I really wanted to focus on telling the story of this player, and through him telling kind of the story of early Brazil, since he'd played for a while in the time where before Brazil started getting a few more sponsors, before Kaboom came onto the scene, before all that stuff happened and Brazil started kind of getting recognized a little bit more internationally. So I think that that is something that maybe I've kind of lost as a writer, and I need to like re-find and reach out to European teams. There is also this weird, like you have brought this up too, with Korean teams and and Chinese teams, where people are like, I don't cover these regions because I can't reach out to teams. And I think that you would be surprised at how open teams are to doing content with English speaking outlets. Like I actually think people would be really surprised if you just reach out. Like it's on you to reach out, but once you do, I think that there's a lot fewer barriers than you might think.
I mean, some of the barriers are the manager's like, oh, okay, here's his Skype. Really, you're gonna give me your player's Skype? Do you realize your player probably has way less responsibility than you do, and you're just gonna be like, oh, here, work it out with him. Yeah, okay, good. This is
He'll
gonna
be here at this time. Doesn't show up for like 2 hours.
This is gonna get done in like 3 weeks, maybe. Good. No.
I mean, that's again like where I'm talking about like coming from the top down, right? Like it's not even that players don't want to do content. It's just that it might not occur to them. Like they are very busy, and their schedules are typically managed by someone else. So, you know, that comes down to communicating, I guess, with media, which then also falls on the team.
If journalists want to do content with an EU org, reach out to Splice. I mean, they've just had this big thing, right? So you could do a great story on them. Their manager is very professional, very efficient, and they're always like offering at EU LCS to do losers interviews. They really want to do content with people. So that's like easily a foot in the door. And if you do something good with Splice, it's something you can show to another European team. It's like, hey, I'm not a psycho, you know?
Good lead off in marketing yourself. Speaking of branding.
Yeah. I think so that's just something to throw out there is like if you want to do content about European players, it's something you can do. We can't necessarily guarantee an audience though, so it's still the issue. Anyway, do you have any other big points, or did we cover most stuff?
That is it for, I got my Korea rant in there.
Oh, I wanted to do something. It's like, okay, why should you watch EU LCS? All right. So we've talked about all these problems and all these issues, but why is it worth it? Why should you just not scrap EU LCS and get rid of it anyway? Where are these storylines that I keep talking about that are so great? I think that someone asked me, it's like, okay, if you can write a feature about NIP, you're a god. NIP would be one of the easiest teams
oh my gosh, yes,
to write a feature about. Actually insane. I mean, I think that if you even if you start with like some of the more challenging stuff, like Spraddle, super challenging actually, because his career has been like kind of a failure. And then he's like had this weird situation where he had the nickname with the pro miscue and the Morgana thing. What people don't know is that for whatever weird reason, like he was on PSG before this, is that like weirdly a lot of European pro players were hyping him up, like strangely, before this split. So you could easily go out there and you could get interviews with like some of these AD carries who wanted to play with Spraddle for whatever reason. And you could write an interview about that, and you could look at some of his matches where he had like this weird, crazily good Thresh game against Unicorns of Love. And then the narrative becomes about, it's like, why hasn't Spraddle gotten good? What is Spraddle missing? And I think you could actually make a pretty cool, convincing piece just on Spraddle. You could go on like Heek. He was a rookie last split. Apparently his motivation and his work ethic is actually really crazy if you talk to him. Like, this guy really wants to succeed. Unfortunately, he can only really play Jhin. But the amount that he improved last split on Giants, of all teams, is actually kind of insane. And so the question is, like, if he's not continuing the same rate of improvement, what is wrong with NIP, right? So, is there something it's like, Let me count the ways.
I
Nagne.
mean, what is wrong with NIP is like an entire thing. But yeah, I was gonna bring up both Nagane and Prophet as like really easy
Yeah.
storylines. I'm actually writing a thing on Prophet, kind of, but that's tangentially related. That's just about exports from SK Telecom. Do they work? Why don't they work? If so, but like, there's also Nagane, who was this super, like, I don't know if people remember, but he was like super hyped after season 3 because he had a really good showing. Yeah, because his champion pool was like very in meta at the World Championship, and he was this new player, and everyone was like, "Holy crap, this new mid laner is going to be amazing." And then it never really worked out. Why didn't it? Well, there are a few things that have kind of come out as half jokes from his ex KT teammates, where they're like, "Well, maybe if you had practiced more." They actually said this in a interview. They're like, "Maybe if you practice more, you'd still be on KT." And so like, there's definitely something there. Like, what was he doing when he wasn't on the team? Like, was he in the mountains training? Like, where was he? He just kind of disappeared.
He took a break, is what he told me.
And now he's back. Like, what's the story there?
He wouldn't explain what went wrong with LSPL, except for that there were communication issues. It's like, yeah, communication issues got you relegated twice. I don't know about that. But sure. Let's go for that. I don't know. He's a really interesting character, I guess, just in and of itself. Just the evolution of. I would even go so far as it's like, how can you maintain a career playing limited cools in any given meta, limited champions in any given meta? I think that could be an interesting, just like, opinion piece there. I think NIP actually really want you to interview their Korean players. If, like, I asked for an interview with Shook, it's like, do you want, sure, that's great, do you want to interview Nakne? It's like, sure. But there's, like, yeah, and Shook, of course, is one of the most storied characters of Europe. Of course. I don't know, there are a lot of, and then, of course, just Nico the Pico, it's like, why did NIP decide to give this guy a team? I think that's a really interesting story that's underexplored. I think, like, the fact that NIP advertised themselves as a team that basically just wanted to stay in LCS, that was kind of the goal to split. So, but I was talking about, like, okay, so we just came up with, I don't know how many storylines and things you could write about NIP. When you have an NIP versus Mysterious Monkeys matchup, for example, you can talk about the fact that Kikis thinks how important veterans are, and what are the veterans doing for Monkeys versus what are the veterans doing for NIP. How insane would it be to do an amazing Shook like retrospective type deal? It's like, how did they get here?
Man, now that you say that, I really want to write one.
An amazing Shook retrospective.
Yeah, that's such a great story.
So it's like, we just talked about bottom tier teams and how it would be really interesting. And these guys have personalities. Have you seen Amazing go off on Twitter? Like, this guy, he just, you say something like, I think Amazing may have missed an ultimate in that one game. It's like, everyone underrates me. People say I'm washed up. People just don't know what they're talking about. I'm just really tired of being underrated, man. Like, what is this? Yeah, I think Amazing is great if you want personality. He's hilarious. So I don't know. I don't really buy into the narrative that these players don't have personality, that you can't market them. Kikis is great. I did a great interview with Kikis, actually. He was really open about how he felt like G2 didn't trust him when he was on G2. And now the big difference for him on Mysterious Monkeys is that his team trusts him now to play what he can and to carry them. And he thought that that was really important. And he was like really honest about that. So I don't know. I think that there's stuff there for sure. And even like, you'd be surprised. I think EU players are much more willing to say shit than NA players generally.
I would agree with that, actually.
For sure. So if you want, like, I think you're more likely.
NA players, I think, so for the reasons that I said, because they typically do have like managers or PR people that are really good about like hooking them up with media. I think that the flip side to that is that they also are a lot more well trained. Sometimes of their own volition. Like apparently Mike Young studies like interviews so he can like present himself really well on camera. So like I think that is something that I've noticed that European players have a lot.
I mean, I think
Smaller
also
cylinder.
there's just less of a filter in some of these countries. Um, so, I mean, I love it. I think it's really fun. So I think that's something that it's like if you want a player who's gonna say something that's fun, I actually in my interviews I get a lot of stuff like that, but I don't make it the title because I know Reddit will take it out of context and it'll be a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read my interviews, like there's a lot of stuff like that, and I don't even ask questions about that stuff. I just ask about the game. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of stuff that people are overlooking in terms of storyline potential, and like the fact that people are saying these players have no personality is like really absurd. I mean, even when they try to make jokes and it's super forced, it's kind of cute. Like the Boris thing. It's like we owe all of our stuff to Boris. Who's Boris? I guess you'll have to find out. Okay, you guys really didn't think this through, did you? Like, so I just I don't know. I feel like really upset that people think that EU LCS is boring, and I think that it's a really big failure on the parts of production, on teams, on production, on people like me. Even though I get weird, it's like, of course it's not my job. I'm an analytical writer, but I just like whatever.
I'll blame
Uh,
me. Just blame me.
so it just I don't know. I think on that end, that's kind of all I wanted to say. Thanks everyone for watching. Tune in for EU LCS this week. If you have kept up with the Twitter memes, there is some great Rick and Morty themed action between G2 and Misfits going on where
Yeah.
someone is going to be mercy killed. I'm not really sure who. Anyway, thank you again and talk to you guys later.